Great.
All right. Graziana, thank you so much for joining us here at the IPM. We're very happy to have you here with us. I'll briefly introduce you, if that's all right, and then we'll just move on to the questions. Graziana Ciola teaches at the University of Havot in Nijmegen. She runs an ERC project right now at the same institution called I Square, the Impossible and the Imaginable, Late Medieval Semantics of Impossibility and the Roots of Complex Mathematics. And we'll hear everything about this project soon. And we're particularly happy to have Graziana on board for our interview today. So thank you very much, Graziana, for your time.
Thank you very much for having me. It's really a pleasure.
It's our pleasure. So Graziana, your project that I've just announced explores a shift in the history of mathematics using medieval logic. Can you tell us first about the latter, medieval logic? Namely, what research projects on medieval logic have you been previously developing, and what are the ones that you are currently engaged in?
Yes, so my relationship with medieval logic kind of emerged from my undergrad studies, actually. I always wanted to do something that had something to do with Latin and something to do with mathematics, and somehow I ended up doing philosophy. And I got stuck. Well, I got stuck. I fell in love with medieval things, and so I developed my master level thesis for the Institute of Advanced Studies in Pavia, where I did my undergrad and master's studies on Gilbert of Poitiers and 12th century theories of modalities, for the most part, trying to figure out what's going on with Gilbert and whether he has a notion of logical possibility. So that's how I got into this. So I was already a bit on the semantic side of things. I was interested in possibility, necessity, impossibility, stuff like counterfactual identity, whether you can be you and not someone else across different possible worlds, that type of stuff. And the medievals are kind of very rich to explore these themes. So I had a historical interest, but I had a theoretical interest, and logic was my gateway drug to these matters. Then I went to do my PhD, and I knew I wanted to do history and philosophy of logic, and I ended up at the Scuola Normale in Pisa, where there were people doing logic at the time, Lolli, Mugnai, so logic, set theory, history of logic. And Marsilius kind of happened to me, meaning that I got in with a project on Abelard and on 12th century logic, and then someone was around who had this reproduction of a manuscript of Marsilius' Consequences. And I just happened to receive it and say, oh, see what you can do about it. I don't want to work on it. I was like, yeah, this is cool stuff. And that became my PhD thesis. So I started straightforwardly with 14th century nominalism. I had already worked on the 14th century at university. So I wanted to switch back to the 12th, but I got stuck in the 14th. I used to work on other matters, Franciscans, prophecy, alchemy, that type of thing. If you look my list of publication, you'll see Rupes Kissa coming up and up again. He will be forever with me. But I managed to actually switch to actual logic and mostly nominalistic authors through the theory of consequences. So theories of consequences are those developments, systematizations, especially in the 14th century, of whatever relation subsists from an assumption, a premise, a set of premises, and a conclusion. and trying to figure out how you get from the one to the other. In broadest terms, of course, you can get there in several ways. You can get there from, syllogistically. A syllogism is a consequence. You can get there by asserting the premises. So you stand by them, you believe them. You can get there by, well, if the premises were true, they might not be, then the consequence would be true. You would still be dragged there. I was interested in these type of theories, and Marsilius of Inghen had a treatise on this, and it was unedited, like many of Marsilius of Inghen's works. So I started doing the edition and historical philosophical commentary. That was my PhD thesis. At the end of the day, I just continued working on these themes. I was at UCLA for a year and a half afterwards. I did my PhD in co-supervision with UCLA, so it was not getting far from home. Yeah, still working on theories of consequences and later reception. So medieval logic broadly construed, also chronologically. And then I went to Durham for a year, developing a little project on Richard de Bury and Burleigh and the new physics. So the connection between this type of reasoning, so reasoning by consequences, trying to figure out the relationship between premises and conclusions, and their applications to the reception of Aristotle's physics in the late 13th and 14th century. So this is the conceptual background to all the later movement of the calculatores in the English tradition. So trying to figure out how these two concerns, doing logic and figuring out the physical world in a generically Aristotelian picture, came together in this specific set, a cultural set of authors and concerns in Northern England around this Bishop of Durham, Richard de Bury. So that's what I did for a while. And then I just ended up in Nijmegen with a postdoc, always working on Marsilius, because I realized that that was really not so much where my heart lied, but where a new way of conceiving consequences were. If you look at the history of how we think of these matters, so if you think about it, logical consequence, so this following of something from something else, of a conclusion from a premise, of a consequent from an antecedent, what can be drawn from what is at the heart of what a logic is. Like, at the end of the day, what you want a logical system to give you is a way from going from A to B and know that you're actually at B, that you can reach B and you're not at C or not at D, but you are exactly at the conclusion you want it to be at, without any doubt. That's what a logic does. At the end of the day, it's just an instrument for reasoning. So far, so good. In the Middle Ages, let me rephrase it slightly. In the way in which modern logicians, so logicians from around the time of De Morgan Frege, 19th century logicians, looked back at these enterprises in the Middle Ages, they started criticizing the idea, that's almost a fair criticism, that the medievals cannot really distinguish between what the different iterations of this following are. What do I mean? The medievals can't really, according to these people, and that's partially true, the medievals can't account for what's a syntactic consequence. So for whatever I can draw from a set of axioms syntactically, formally, what is a consequence in meaning, so what we would call a material consequence. So what I can draw as a conclusion from like the meaning of a term, of a premise, or whatever you have at hand. So yeah, sure, you are a man, therefore you are necessarily mortal. There's nothing formal in that. Still seem to pretty much follow that if you're a human, you will die eventually. So that type of stuff. And what's a conditional? Like what is an inference? These are formally distinguished notions, and of course you can start distinguishing them formally at some point. But there seemed to be pretty much a big meatloaf in the medieval tradition, not only in the medieval tradition, and that's a criticism that was moved, and I was really interested in this problem. I was really interested in this problem in a particular set of authors, and those are the 14th century nominalists, because the 14th century nominalists, whoever or whatever they might be, seem to maintain, I'm talking about people like Occam, Buridan, Marsilius of Inghen, Peter of Ailly, Albert of Saxony, all these folks. So they maintain more or less the same semantic. That's basically, we're talking about individual things. And when you refer to individual things, you kind of need to be able to point at them. And why wouldn't these people with very elegant, complex, and recognizably well-built logical systems, we still think of Occam as a great logician, we still think of Buridan as a great logician, wouldn't be able to distinguish these notions. So this was the way I got into this matter. Of course, when you work on consequences, so when you work on a theory of inference, on a theory of entailment, however you want to call it, you end up having to deal with what the terms refer to, for a series of reasons. The first is that, yes, medieval theories of consequence are not theories of of formal consequences, like we would define them nowadays. Partly they are the Buridanian definition that's endorsed by all these 14th century nominalist authors, followers of Buridan, is that a consequence is formal when it still holds under any uniform permutation of the terms, of the categorematic terms, which is more or less how we would define something formal. But Buridan has plenty of material consequences that are just as valid. So, and when you work on these things, you have to start looking at the reference of the terms. So at what those terms not only mean, so human means all the humans, but actually as the whole set of humans that those terms pick up for a series of technical reasons. And doing it semantically, so starting to look at the semantics and at the modal semantics is a bit unavoidable. So that was what I was working on. And this idea of trying to figure out the relationship between medieval logic and mathematics had always been a bit in the background since I started working on these things. I'm answering also the other questions at the same time. I'm sorry.
No worries.
I'm just going with the story.
Yes, but that's great. That's actually great. It laid down the medieval logic bit. And now for my last question, I want to ask it about Marsilius of Inghen, that you're also an expert on thought. What areas of his thought, both in logic that you mentioned a little bit, and also perhaps in other domains, do you find more interesting or promising for research at the moment?
Well, I'm definitely into Marsilius logic. I don't think I can make a mystery of that, or there is any ambiguity about that. I think Marsilius was just a nice person. Like, I mean, he was a very interesting author and a very unusual nominalist. But overall, you look at this philosopher at the bulk of his work that is still, for the vast majority, unedited. So definitely, there is plenty of research to do just producing the objective texts. That's step one. He has been very influential as a natural philosopher. I think that the work on Marsilius with the most and longest circulation, besides the treatises on supposition and ampliation that are part of my project, a central part of my project right now, are his questions on Aristotle's De Generatione et Corruptione, on generation and corruption. As far as I know, there's more than 300 manuscripts. I think it's 372, but I'm just giving numbers. I don't remember on the top of my head the exact number, but more than 300 copies is a lot, without counting the printed editions. It's a text that's read, commented, criticized still by people like Galileo, so it has a long tradition. It's hugely influential. So definitely Marsilius' natural philosophy needs a lot more work to be carried out, just for the brute amount of materials to work on. He's an interesting theologian, like Martin Hunen has been carrying out work on Marsilius as a theologian. But the overall impression you get from Marsilius is that he tries to be coherent, but as a game. Like, he's a very playful philosopher, which makes him a very good philosopher. He doesn't seem like the type of person who stands by a principle because he believes in it, just because it's a preconception. You see him go to the extreme consequences of an assumption, any assumption, and just build a coherent, systematic picture around it and try to make it fit with everything else he's maintaining. But overall, he's a possibilist. Like you say, if you assume this, then like this is the concept. Do what you want. I think this might work, but he's kind of non-committal, which I enjoy. I find it personally a good, healthy way of handling these matters. And apparently he was a very pious man, and very generous. So like Monica Brinzey, who's concluding, if she didn't already just recently conclude, an ERC project studying the influences between masters in Central and Eastern European universities, actually found sources where Marsilius loaned money to students in need around Europe. He was a nice fellow. Of course, he was asking for the money back eventually, but I imagine he offered a better deal than most. So yeah, nothing changes. The more you look at medieval sources, the more you notice that nothing has changed. We do the same type of job. But yeah, I really think he was a nice guy. I like to study him. I like to spend time with him. I think his logic is extremely interesting. The gut guess that's being tested right now by people on my team is that what Marsilius does in modal semantics is a precursor of stuff like modal Meininganism, so impossible world semantics, which is a weird position to have if you're a nominalist. But if you're playful and you get to the extreme consequences, and you're not particularly committed to actually the purism of not having anything else but individuals, like, well, of course you don't have anything else but individuals in the world. That doesn't mean that you don't need powerful analytical tools where you put in other stuff. So yeah, that's my fondness on Marsilius. I think his logic is think there is a lot of work to do, both historical and philosophical, on his logic and metaphysics. And definitely historians of science should look at Marsilius' natural philosophy, so physics, and on generation and corruption. He has a very weird and eccentric, that's a good word, eccentric version of nominalism, if we can talk about nominalism. As you know, and as probably most of your readers know, nominalism, two 14th century authors, it's an anachronistic label. That's how 15th century philosophers started identifying the schoolmasters, the tendencies they wanted to embody. Yeah, if Marsilius is a nominalism, and if there is any such thing as a nominalist, or if there is any such thing as 14th century nominalism, definitely he is an odd and interesting one to be seen in the context. So historical and conceptual reasons. Cool guy.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Marsilius' views on modal semantics and this bit, because it also seems to play a central part in as one of the sub-projects of your current ERC. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about that project. What are the guiding ideas that started it, where it is right now, and where you see the project going ahead?
Yes. So we are just a few months in, so we're still setting things up. The guiding ideas, there's a bit of an autobiographical bit on how this project came up, basically. So I mentioned I've been thinking about this since I was doing all the things I told you I was doing at the time. I think there are two fundamental concerns. One is about the way in which I was taught mathematics in middle school, last year of middle school, up to the first year of high school. And that's the following way. You start doing equations. And at some point, they give you square roots. And they tell you, you can't do the square root of a negative number. That is impossible. Okay, so far so good. Makes sense. I mean, if minus per minus is plus, nothing negative is the square of anything, so you can't do the square because that's a reverse operation. Yeah. And then you get to, 5 months later, 3 months later, depending on how fast you go on your middle school program, you get to high school, and the first thing they teach you is complex numbers and imaginary mathematics. And I was like, what? So I'm trying to reconcile myself with that what. And if you look at what happens in history, actually, up to basically the 16th century, the overall up to the 19th century, when you can give a complete algebra for complex numbers, people have had the same worry widespread among mathematicians. You can't do the square root of a negative number. That doesn't make any sense. That's just impossible. So that was in the background of my childhood trauma, if you want. On the other hand, one of the things that was fashionable to say when I was a PhD, so not that many years ago, I hope, not as many as I would like to. I don't want to admit that it was quite a bit of years ago, so let's pretend that's not the case. The issue when you would start and do medieval logic, it was already falling out of fashion to do medieval logic by formalizing medieval theories into contemporary language. So we're talking about I started in 2012. Parsons' book, Articulating Medieval Logic, came out in 2014. And that's a book that shows you how you can formalize medieval logic from within. So without imposing any logical formalism that's That's superimposed. It's what we do. So you can, of course, you can formalize anything however you want, but you need to make the theory you want to formalize speak for itself and not lose anything essential. At the time, the question had become, why is medieval logic not mathematized? And I still think it's a big question in certain circles. These people had a model of axiomatic theory because they had the first 9 books of Euclid's Elements. So that's an axiomatic deductive theory. Why in the world they didn't think to do this with less ambiguous instruments than a regimented version of medieval Latin? That might be an artificial regimented language, but it's still not a pure logical language. It's not aseptic. It's a language that brings semantical and metaphysical dirty concerns within it. Well, on the one hand, because of course medieval logic is a reflection on language itself and what you can do with it up to a certain degree of artificiality. But I also started thinking on what if the relation between logic and mathematics is not of dependence on the end of logic, of like didactical, pedagogical, and conceptual dependence. So what if these people see actually mathematics as a subordinated science to what logic is doing? So it seemed to me more conceptually fruitful. And then I started thinking, so there are empty terms, and those are a big problem in medieval logic, or in any vaguely Aristotelian system, because for a series of technical reasons, vaguely Aristotelian logic and the medievals for the most part, can't afford to have true affirmative statements about subjects that are not instantiated in reality. So about what we call empty terms. So, for example, all dodos are birds. A medieval logician would say that's false. Of course, dodos are birds, even if there are no dodos, because what else could they possibly be? Or think of ideal gases. So an ideal gas is a gas with no that's infinitely compressible. Of course, there is no ideal gas in nature, and definitely nothing physical like concrete is infinitely compressible. So why would you want a statement to be true? It can't be true. So that is a problem for affirmations in medieval logic. And of course, you might want to have true statements about things that are not there, to make general statements about natural classes that happen to be empty. Medieval logicians usually talk about roses in winter, thunder on a clear day, but you have to think it in general terms within certain restrictions. So, but that's what the problem is about. And at some point, and the theory seems to have been formalized by Marsilius, they start talking about reference that are not in the real world, but are in an imaginable model domain, and those are the Imaginabilia. These Imaginabilia, for Marsilius, can include stuff that's intrinsically contradictory. So I'm not going into the technicality of this, but I can say something true at the outskirts of ampliation theory, affirmatively true, about the round square. The standard medieval example is the Kimera. So things that are made up of bits, conceptual bits that can't stay together, that are contradictory to each other. And still I can say something true about it, which is convenient if you want to talk about space with no dimension, which is a mathematical point, or space with no mass. It's a good tool to have in your arsenal. Let's put it like that. So this is basically Marsilius' new addition to modal semantics. And it gets picked up very influentially by the tradition. So, okay, so we have my trauma with square roots of negative numbers, and we have all this very nice picture of 14th century modal semantics. But look at what happens. So a square root of a negative number is a self-contradictory operation, because of course it's a reverse of operation of nothing. It's the reverse operation of a square that's not there, right? So it's taken to be intrinsically contradictory. So is a chimera, so is a round square. It's something just as contradictory and as inconceivable as the square root of a negative number. So the guess was, this is the same problem. So 14th century logic and up to 16th century mathematics, or pre-modern mathematics up to a certain point, had the fundamentally same problem. They didn't have the conceptual tools to think about what such a thing as a chimera or the negative number could possibly mean. So you just could not conceive it. And the hypothesis that's moving this project was like, okay, but wait. What if instead of trying to figure out how why mathematics is not something in medieval logic, we figure out whether these developments in medieval logic actually influenced the history of mathematics. Because once 14th century logicians start to think about chimeras positively, and you become able to do stuff about chimeras, you can possibly trace a line of continuity up to the first person who actually writes conceptually about doing the square root of a negative number as something that's not completely inconceivable, and that's Girolamo Cardano in 16th century Pavia, early 16th century Pavia. The historical guess is that people who receive Marsilius, who are partly transmitted in Pavia, have been read by Cardano. So the logic of Marsilius has given people like Cardano the conceptual tools to actually think that this operation is not as meaningless as it was previously deemed by the previous tradition. Sorry, I'm putting it a bit confusedly, but
no, you're not.
But yeah, that's how it came up. A bunch of suggestions and worries coming together, and the simple observation of a historical fact: there is a massive transmission of Marsilius in Pavia. People like Mariani, Anneliese Meyer, once upon a time made the mistake of thinking that this passage in Giovanni Marliani, in the Libertà Reazione, I think, where he calls Marsilius of Inghen Marsilius Noster, actually witnessed Marsilius actually going to Pavia at some point in 1370s, where he kind of falls off the map. Nobody believes that that's the case anymore. What it does witness is that Marsilius is read in Pavia, and there are discussions about this Marsilius in Pavia, particularly Yanni, Freddy, and these authors that on matters of impossibility, conceivability, imaginability are punctually quoted by Cardano. So if there is an actual transmission, it's most likely through these authors. And that's what this project historically is trying to test, besides trying to figure out the conceptual relationships between bits and pieces, and what Marsilius model semantics actually does. So that's the picture.
Thank you. That was brilliantly put, and the fascinating hypothesis the project sort of runs on is very original, because the connection, as you just mentioned, between medieval logic and mathematics is sort of far from clear yet. And I wanted to ask one more question about this, which is the texts on mathematics that the project and the team is looking at currently. Can you describe a bit what kind of mathematical practitioners or mathematical works that are relevant for the project? You already mentioned Cardano, of course.
Yeah, we're actually working mostly on later mathematical works. The mathematical part of the project will be given to a postdoc, who ideally will be a historian of mathematics, of Renaissance mathematics, because very intentionally, we have no medieval mathematics in the project per se. We only have mathematical developments from Cardano onwards. And we're going to trace the reflection on the vocabulary, because Cardano calls these numbers impossible numbers or sophistical numbers. Then you have the first people to give you, the first person to give you a calculus for these things is Raffaele Bombelli in his algebra. And he calls them impossible, or he calls them impossible numbers. The first to use the term imaginary, as far as I know, is Descartes in so part of the issue would be figuring out where the vocabulary with which we talk about these numbers come from, how it evolves up to Descartes and Mendelssohn, the 16th up to early 17th century period. But we're not looking at any medieval mathematical text for the simple reason that this type of operation is not carried out.
Right.
So working on the square root of negative numbers, Cardano is not the first one to do it. Tartaglia does it, Del Ferro does it. He's the first one to actually write about what he's doing, so to reflect on it. But it's an issue that comes up within some technical problems with solving cubic equations, for the most part, some square equations. If you think about it, it's really easy to stumble upon the square root of a negative number. And people like Heron of Alexandria, so like ancient Greek mathematicians, had already done so in the Alexandrine equations. If I say x squared plus 1 equals 0, how do you solve it? X squared equals minus 1. So x equals the square root of minus 1. Ancient mathematicians would stumble upon this and freak out, say, okay, there must be a mistake somewhere. This does make no sense. This doesn't make any sense. So the techniques and the mathematical problems in the Latin West were definitely tackled a bit later. As far as I know, I'm no specific historian of mathematics. There is no systematic philosophical reflection on this particular issue in medieval mathematics proper. And overall, we are looking at a conceptual development. What I really care about is how a concept becomes thinkable. Once the concept becomes thinkable, you can have a series of applications of that concept. And the most obvious manipulable and traceable example seem to me figuring out how an inconceivable impossibility in mathematics becomes conceivable and positive, because you can obtain very real results by going through these impossible non-existent numbers. So that's the move. Lots of Renaissance mathematics, not a lot of medieval mathematics, but that's on purpose, because the claim is that you should look for the roots of the problem. Pardon the play on concepts. For the roots of the negative roots, of the roots of negative numbers in medieval logic, rather than in mathematical practices.
Right. Yes. Okay, so I have to go to our last question, unfortunately, because I could hear you for a long bar on these issues. And about the RSC grant itself, and the experience of getting it. Can you tell us a little bit how that played out?
Yes, that was a lot of work. Yeah, that was a lot of work. I mean, I think there is a myth that these grants have a bit of a mystique, if you want. They're really hard to get. They're impossible to get for the few elects. That's not true. What you really need is a good idea. A good idea that's financeable by the ERC grant, which is something that's slightly crazy, but not too crazy, so crazy enough. I think they're figuring out, like, I think that this project, like trying to figure out whether really these medieval chimeras are the, I don't know, conceptual and actually genetical grandmothers of complex mathematics, of imaginary numbers. It's actually the right kind of crazy. But you don't need an extraordinary profile. You just need to be credible for the type of work you want to carry out. The guidelines that the ERC does, and the tools, the support tools for writing a good grant, are actually freely accessible online, and I strongly encourage everybody to use them. Statistically speaking, these grants are not impossible to get. Part of the issue is that not as many people apply as they could, because they think, oh, it's very hard. It's a lot of work. It's a bit of a bet. Of course, it can really change the situation for a young scholar like I was. I hope I still am. Can give you your own team. It can help you develop a big, complex research with many interconnected parts that you wouldn't be able to develop by yourself. So your idea needs to fit the scheme. But if you have a big idea and you need a lot of money and a lot of people to test whether it works, and it's just, a bit off the beaten path, VRC is the scheme for you. Of course, I was a bit stressed through the process, because, yeah, the mystique was there, but looking backwards, I shouldn't have been not as I was. It's feasible. Of course, I did it, and I'm no great genius, and I don't have 1,000 publications. I just like to think about these little things and these logical games. You don't need, for sure, I think that this project proves scheme-wise and funding-wise that you don't need to be talking about non-European, non-white, non-male philosophers. That you don't need any particularly socially relevant things, because yes, of course, imaginary numbers are very socially relevant. I mean, we are talking right now because we have enough equations with J, and that's how the physicists write it, YAL. But yeah, it's without imaginary numbers, you wouldn't have Maxwell's equations, you wouldn't have a screen, we wouldn't be talking. That's the gist of it. So there's a relevance. Certainly, it's not going to help you build bridges. What's going to help you do is trying to figure out how we think about things that are hard to conceive. It's going to help you figure out whether these medieval theories can still speak to contemporary enterprises in logic, especially in non-standard semantics. Let's not forget that, all developments in modal and temporal logics have been carried out in the past century, looking at what the medievals were doing. So contemporary logic might not remember it very well, and it's not its job to remember it very well, but it kind of is born by direct filiation and not by remote tradition from suggestions from the medievals. So this is a conversation that can still be fruitful, and that projects like this can contribute to. But yeah, overall, I'm trying to for now, I want to figure out whether this is true or not, whether my hypothesis is right or not. Big risk, big reward. So that's my career plan for now. Just doing the work, and then we'll see. I think there are many doors that can be open or closed, depending on from the research. Certainly, we have a big open question. That's the question that's been hanging in the background of everything I've been saying today, and that's what's late medieval nominalism. And I'm not going to answer now, and I don't think anybody's going to answer anytime soon by themselves. But these things are little bits and pieces that can help with figuring it out. So yeah.
Yes. So with that, I'd like to thank you again, Graziana, for the interview. It was really amazing. I love hearing you about these things, and I am sure that a lot of our readers would also love hearing you about this.
Well, thank you for having me. I've been rambling a bit, but I hope some of it was interesting and not too messy. But really, thank you for having me, and I hope this project can be, can be suggestive at least for people who are not technician. I think that working on technicalities should have more general answers, or more general features of interest than the merely technical result. So yeah, thank you.